Welcome to our Safe Sanctuary training. The United Methodist Church is expected to implement policies and procedures for reducing the risk of abuse in their ministries with children, youth, and vulnerable adults. So, in this training, we will learn why churches have safe places, why we want to create safe places, and why we want to make sure that all who walk through our doors feel safe. So, we're going to talk about why and we're going to talk about how. This training also addresses issues that impact church, pastors, business administrators, trustees, anyone on staff, people who are paid or volunteer. It applies to everyone. It's for big churches, large churches, small churches, churches of all sizes. So this is the promise from the United Methodist hymnal that says, with God's help, we will so order our lives after the example of Christ, that this child of God, surrounded by steadfast love, may be established in faith and confirmed and strengthened in the way that leads to life eternal. So this promise really sums up the value of our work to create safe sanctuaries. By adequately screening our workers, we do interviews, we do trainings, we do background checks. We make sure that all of our workers will surround our children and youth with steadfast love. So we utilize procedures such as the 2-adult rule, open doors and windows, and use appropriate discipline, which we'll talk more about in a little bit. This way we can be confident that all of God's children will be established in the faith and confirmed and strengthened in the way that leads to life eternal. So let's talk a little bit about the risk. What could happen in kind of the worst case scenario? This slide is from Church Mutual Insurance Company materials. So there could be a lot of consequences if the safe sanctuary policy is violated. And so some of those consequences include a financial consequence, litigation, media coverage, negative media coverage. Those are the ones that we most often hear about. But there's some even deeper consequences that are found, including a spiritual crisis for the victimized persons, traumatized families, congregational disunity, and shattered trust, which are all far more damaging for the individuals, their families, and the ministry itself. So here's the impact. There are two scenarios. If a person became a victim while attending a program in your church, not only is his or her physical, emotional well-being negatively impacted, but so is their relationship with God. Why didn't God protect me in God's house? How could a loving God let this happen? Just think of the impact on you as a church worker if you were falsely accused of wrongdoing. The emotional and financial impact would be devastated. So let's get educated. There's different types of abuse, so we're just going to kind of go through some of that now. So abusive treatment is not accidental behavior on the part of the abuser. Abuse is going to be intentional. Notice that word, deliberate, intentional. So there are many indicators of physical abuse, including these that are listed, but the presence of these does not guarantee abuse. However, the presence of the indicators listed here are a good reason to investigate the possibility of abuse. Abusive treatment is not accidental, no matter the type. There is also sexual abuse, and we want to be mindful of that. So again, these are indicators of sexual abuse, and some of these we may see for other reasons, but it's important to remember that these could be red flags that could indicate that more investigation is necessary. So, for instance, if a child is discovered to have a sexually transmitted disease, that's a big red flag, and it's important to investigate the possibility of sexual abuse. There's also emotional abuse. Again, it's not going to be accidental, it's intentional, but this is another kind of abuse. We're all conscious of bullying these days, so we want to be really careful about that as well. So the indicators of emotional abuse are a little bit more difficult to discover, These indicators can be diagnoses themselves, or the indicators can be symptoms of other conditions. Neglect is the most common type of abuse, and it's one that's more obvious. So, neglect is when we're endangering health, safety, or welfare, and we'll talk more about some signs of that. There's also ritual abuse, which is observed in cult behavior, and financial abuse or exploitation of the disabled or elderly is also a sad reality in some families. So, some indicators of neglect are listed here. It is not a guarantee of neglect when you observe these indicators, but it's important to check them out. Ritual abuse is the least often reported form of abuse. However, those who are ritually abused sometimes report being abused in a church setting. So that's why we're talking about that today. Indicators of ritual abuse are listed here. So here's some facts. This is a tough thing to talk about, but it's important to talk about the profile of a child molester. We do not have an actual profile of the most typical child molester, but some of the characteristics are listed here. And the scariest, to me, one of the scariest things to know is the abuser is very often already known by the child and trusted by the child. So we want to be careful to think about this fact, especially in small member congregations. Even when everybody knows everybody, that's not a guarantee. Signs that abuse occurred in the church. So these signs listed here, if a child or youth develops these behaviors, especially if they were previously enthusiastic about participation at church, the possibility of abuse must be taken seriously. It is our moral and legal duty to get help for those who need it. The way that we do this is through documentation and through reporting. So let's talk a little bit more about what we need to report if we see or suspect. So we need to be prepared to report accidents. This is actually very common that happens, especially in our kids' building or our events. If there are accidents, we have a way that we report that. There's also a proper protocol to report incidents of abuse or suspected abuse that we have reasonable cause to believe has happened. So we have to document accidents for insurance purposes, and we have to document incidences so that someone's behavior can be addressed. If a behavior reoccurs after an intervention, additional steps should be taken. Reporting suspected abuse in good faith and allowing DFACs to investigate begins the process of help and of healing for those affected. All reports are immediately and confidential. So, in the state of Georgia, all of us that work with children, youth, students, young adults are considered mandated reporters. And in the state of Georgia, it is law that we have to report abuse within 24 hours of the time that abuse is suspected or has been reported to us. And I can tell you, in the state of Georgia as well, there's a good faith clause in here that if you report it and you're incorrect, then there's no consequence for that. And we would rather report it and be wrong than not report it and be right. So the law is on your side, being required to report, and there are no consequences for you if you're incorrect, and the accuser will not know, or the accused will not know who reported. So our church has a specific church reporting plan. When we are reporting accidents or incidents, it's important to use the reporting forms to document the events. And it's also important to keep the information it's also important to keep information confidential. We want to be prepared and we have a plan in case bad things happen. So we want to make sure that we fill out the proper procedures. If you're not sure where the paperwork or what you need, the first thing you want to do is you're going to report it to appropriate member of church staff who will then help you with the next steps. But what we actually do is we report it within the conference and it's turned over to DFACS, and DFACS does all of the investigation. We do not investigate. We are there for the children and youth and support them and pray for them, but it's definitely not our duty to investigate or talk about it. Once it's been reported, then there's only one designated person who would speak to any kind of media. So what do we do now? There are definitely things that we have in place because our main goal is prevention and safety is our number one priority. And that's why we have these procedures in place. So we want to make sure that we are following these procedures. So that's why we're doing these trainings. We also have Safe Sanctuary Covenant that we have you fill out so that you are clear on what the expectations are. And then we want to make sure that you're familiar with the Safe Sanctuary policy. We want you to always be evaluating what is happening. And if you determine that there's an area of weakness, please report it to someone on staff immediately. Safety is our number one priority. So that way we can all be safe at all times. So here's what we promise to do at the Orchard. We do screen all of our workers, whether you're volunteer or paid, and that includes a background check, criminal background check. We have operating procedures and policies in place. We require training yearly. We have a reporting strategy in place as well. We also, to go more in depth with our operating procedures, here's some things that we do at the Orchard. We have what's called the 2 adult rule. And so that means that basically the big deal is you never want to have a one-on-one with an adult and a child. We want to make sure that there's always at least 2 volunteers present in a room. When we have 1 child, 10 children, we want to make sure that we have more than 1 volunteer. Now, there are times due to illness or different reasons that we may only have 1 volunteer in the room. And at that time, we're always going to have you may hear a floater. And what that means is it's just a person who floats from room to room as kind of a supervisor and constantly is checking in on you to make sure that everybody's safe and everything is good. If you ever feel like you're in a situation where it's not a good ratio as far as there are not enough adults or volunteers to handle the children, again, please report this right away and let us know so we can get you the help that we need. We keep doors open and we have visible windows so people can see what's going on at all times. We do have a photography policy here. We have kids in foster care for different reasons. Their pictures cannot be posted on social media. Their parents do not want their pictures posted on social media. So we have a photography team who handles our photography, and we ask that we just leave the photography to them. And as a volunteer, please do not take pictures or post pictures. We have to always wear name tags or identifying clothing to let people know that we are volunteers. So make sure that you get that when you check in. We have a check-in and check-out procedure. So volunteers always have to be recorded. We report that to the conference. So please make sure that you are following through with the check-in procedures. At the Orchard currently we use our iPads and we check in through our church database system. We also ask that the volunteers stay until all the children are released. We want to make sure the children are in a safe environment, so that means we have to leave them supervised at all times. So if that's an issue, make sure you let someone know, and we will work with you on getting you where you need to go. For our children's ministry, we have check-in and check-out procedures, which are very important. All of our children wear identifying name tags, which have a number on them. The number The parents get a sticker with a number, and that matches the number on the child. So when we give the children back to their parents at the end of service, we want to make sure that the parents have a sticker with the matching number, and that way we're releasing our children to the proper caregivers. We want to make sure that we always have appropriate touch. So an appropriate touch, we're big fans of high fives and fist bumps. We have to be careful, even with hugs. The best, if a child approaches you for a hug, you can do a side hug or a quick hug. But we just have to be careful. We don't want to have children really sitting in laps, particularly, once they get past toddler age or so. In anywhere that a bathing suit would cover, we definitely don't want to touch that. It's important to remember as well that if you are volunteering in children's ministry or in student ministry, that you always have the appropriate adult behavior. I recognize that not all of our volunteers are legally adults. When we are in a position of leadership as a volunteer, we have to act as the mature, older person in the room. There's always supervision happening with workers and children. We're going to constantly kind of check in and make sure everything's going okay. Yearly, we have training that is required, and we also have our Safe Sanctuaries Covenant, which is what we've been discussing in this training. The Orchard Church has our own bathroom and diapering procedures, and they're very important to consider in ministries with young children. So we need these policies to be followed. So for diapering, we want to make sure that we change diapers in a visible area on a changing table. Of course, we would not leave a child unattended ever on a changing table. This is very important for their safety. We also only have females 18 and over that change diapers. So no males, no teens. Even we've had some cases where there's been siblings who do it at home, and that's fine, but we just don't do it at church just for safety insurance liability reasons. We do have toddlers and preschoolers who are potty training, and so sometimes they need a little bit of extra help. So what we do in that case is we escort them to the restroom and stand outside and let them kind of be independent and do their own thing. If there's an issue where they need a little bit of extra help, we can call for that second adult. This goes back to our 2-adult room, and we have doors open, and we make it, keeping it as modest as possible for the children, but also the thing that we want to avoid is we don't want to go into the restroom and help the child, then the door closes behind you, and now you're one-on-one with the child. So that we definitely don't want to do. So only adults 18 and over, again, helping children in the restrooms. We want to do it in an observable place, and we want to do it where other adults can see us if that's necessary. If it's a big issue, then we would call the parents to come help if they need an outfit change, and they don't have one, or some issue like that. The other thing, we want to check the restrooms before the children enter and just make sure there's no one loitering in there or anything like that. So escort the children to the restroom, please. So there are age-appropriate approaches to discipline, and so we want to talk a little bit about that. At church, we want this to be a place that kids look forward to coming every week, and so for that reason, we keep our discipline very positive and planned. And so some of the basic things that we want to do, we want to make sure that we're using positive words. And so another way that I like to say that is to say the behavior that you do want as opposed to the behavior that you don't want. So an example of that would be if you see a child running, if you say, don't run, the human brain doesn't think in negatives, and particularly the younger that you are. So it's the same principle. If someone says, don't press that red button, the first thing your brain wants to do is press that red button. So ask yourself, what is the behavior that I do want? And say those words instead. So instead of saying, don't run, you can say, stop your feet, walk slowly. Be specific in the behavior that you do want, because often the children may not have an alternative behavior in their mind. If you just say don't run, well, they don't know what to do instead. But if you say walk, they understand what the expectation is, which goes along with our next point, to establish rules and expectations. We do try to maintain a good relationship with the parents and caregivers of our children, youth, students. So we like to let them know if there's an issue, but we always want to make sure we do the sandwich rule, and keep it positive. So if we do have to tell the parents something negative, we want to try to come up with something positive first, let them know what the challenge or struggle was, and end on a positive note. And then the strategy if a children were to threaten themselves or others. So please, if that is happening, we would kind of get them away from the other children immediately if it's an unsafe situation, and get help from someone on staff who will kind of decide what the next steps are in that point. All ministries, we want to make sure that we model and teach participants about appropriate relationships and boundaries, mutual respect and compassion for others. So we do have, we want to make sure that we're anti-bullying, all these things, and they'll always be part of our training here. We'll end with Luke 6:31. Do unto others as you would have them do to you. And that completes our training. Thank you.